Hey folks, Dave Brown here with the New Populist. Thank you again for joining me. Now, one thing I like doing on this channel is going back and finding old interviews or articles written by our political elites where they honestly discuss the geopolitical situation and what the goals are of the U.S. empire. And the reason it's interesting is that when you look at what they said 15 or 20 years ago and contrast it to what they are saying now, you often get two very different stories. And essentially, what they're doing is pretending they don't understand why certain events are happening. They feign ignorance. For example, the Ukraine-Russia war. Our elites say that this war was unprovoked. And when you ask them, why did Russia invade Ukraine? They'll say, well, Putin's an evil guy. He's a dictator. He's a madman. And he wants to recreate the Soviet Union. Now, of course, that explanation is idiotic, but that is what they tell you. And the funny thing, again, is when you look back 15 or 20 years at what they said, they say things that show they clearly understand why certain events have unfolded, the invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, they often times predict these events before they've happened. But then again, 2022, Ukraine gets invaded, and they go, whoa, why did it happen? Now, we don't understand this. This is just a madman, Putin, going out of control. So to show this for the millionth time, because I've done a lot of these videos where I've done this and pointed to past statements to show that they completely understand why these current events have unfolded, I want to go back to a 2006 article written by Robert Kagan, who is a co-founder of the Project for a New North American Century, a neoconservative think tank. And he wrote an article in the Washington Post concerning Russia and China. And if you read what he says, it is abundantly clear that even 18 years ago, he understood the situation in Ukraine. He understood how Russia felt about Ukraine and what may happen if we antagonize Russia and try to move ourselves into Ukraine. It's a very interesting article. And also, Kagan, his wife, is Victoria Nuland, who was the point person from the State Department in Ukraine in 2014 when the government was overthrown. So Robert Kagan is intimately aware of all the intricacies of Ukraine as he is married to Victoria Nuland. So the 2006 Washington Post article, League of Dictators, Why China and Russia Will Continue to Support Autocracies, Robert Kagan, April 30th, 2006, 18 years ago. It starts, ever since liberalism emerged in the 18th century, its inevitable conflict with autocracy has helped shape international politics. What James Madison called the great struggle of the epoch between liberty and despotism dominated much of the 19th century and most of the 20th, when liberal powers lined up against various forms of autocracy in wars both hot and cold. Many believed this struggle ended after 1989 with the collapse of communism, the last claimant to legitimate autocracy, and was supplanted as the main source of global conflict by ancient religions, ethnic and cultural antipathies, a view seemingly confirmed by September 11, 2001, and the rise of Islamic radicalism. Now, of course, 9/11 happens and our entire focus went to the Middle East. But it didn't happen in a vacuum. If you look at the reason given by bin Laden for why he supported terrorism, It goes back to decades of intervention in the Middle East by the United States and the West generally, causing chaos, causing wars, causing regimes to become unstable. And he pointed to that as the reason why he supported terrorism against the United States. And when it comes to Russia and China, in our current situation today, the same thing. It didn't come in a vacuum. It's following decades of conflict, the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and these things never really end. They just simmer down or go out of view, and they pop back up later, and people go, "Oh, where did this come from?" Well, it never went away, and with Russia and China, it never went away. These issues that we had with them, they just were put on the back shelf while we focus somewhere else. In this case, at Islamic terrorism. The article continues, but the present era may be shaping up as, among other things, yet another round in the conflict between liberalism and autocracy. The main protagonist on the side of autocracy will not be the petty dictatorships of the Middle East, theoretically targeted by the Bush Doctrine. They will be the two great autocratic powers, China and Russia, which pose an old challenge not envisioned within the new war on terror paradigm. So Kagan, in 2006, he understands that once this whole thing with the Middle East quiets down, the real challenge is Russia and China. And as we know now, back in the 2000s, the United States was working in Eastern Europe to push certain countries against Russia, and were trying to isolate Russia after Putin came into power. If this seems surprising, it is because neither power took the course most observers predicted. In the late 1990s, despite the failures of Boris Yeltsin, Russia's political and international trajectory seemed roughly to be in a Western liberal direction. China was, as recently as 2002, assumed to be heading toward greater political liberalization at home and greater integration with the liberal world. Sinologists and policymakers argue that whether Beijing's rulers liked it or not, this was the inescapable requirement for transforming China into a successful market economy. And I pointed out in the past that under Yeltsin, we were hoping for Russia to be integrated into our Western system. We have these oligarchs that were there that we were backing up, controlling the country. And of course, when Putin came to power, all these oligarchs, they fled to England with their billions of dollars, and cried about the lack of democracy in Russia. When I always point out what was fair and democratic about the process in which they made themselves tens of billions of dollars at a time when Russia was in a complete state of chaos post the fall of the Soviet Union. These oligarchs were not good guys, and when Putin came into power, he chased most of them off. Now, does that make Putin a good guy? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just pointing out that these oligarchs that we were supporting were not working to make Russia a better place. They were taking advantage of a situation to enrich themselves, which they did. And they made tens of billions of dollars in 90s money. I mean, they were filthy rich. And Russia was going through high unemployment. The alcoholism rate was, really high. Suicide. It was very chaotic. And these guys, instead of trying to make Russia better, were just stuffing their pockets. And we supported that. We supported Yeltsin. We worked to get him reelected in 1996. And we were very disappointed when Putin took over and changed the trajectory. It goes on. Today, these assumptions look questionable even to their authors. Talk of Russia's impending democratization has faded, as has talk of integration. As Dmitry Trendin recently put it, Moscow has left the Western orbit and set out in free flight. China continues to integrate itself in the global economic order, but few observers talk about the inevitability of its political liberalization. Its economy booms even as its leadership firmly maintains one-party rule, so people now talk of a Chinese model in which political autocracy and economic growth go hand in hand. Russia's leaders like this model too, though in their case, economic growth rests on seemingly limitless oil and gas reserves. Until now, the liberal West strategy has been to try to integrate these two powers into the international liberal order, to tame them and make them safe for liberalism. Now stop right there. We are trying to tame them and make them safe for liberalism. What does that entail? What does that mean? How are we doing that? See, we're admitting, even back in 2006, that we're reaching in, interfering, manipulating, playing games to try to tame them. Could you imagine how we would feel if Russia or China were trying to tame us? The idea is preposterous, yet here we are, 2006, Robert Kagan, Washington Post, admitting that that is the Western strategy. We're trying to tame them, make them safe. And from their viewpoint, we're trying to neuter them and make them vassal states, make them like Germany or France, where they essentially go along with the United States and don't really have true independence. It goes on. But the strategy rested on an expectation of their gradual, steady transformation into liberal societies. If instead, China and Russia are going to be sturdy pillars of autocracy over the coming decades, enduring and perhaps even prospering, then they cannot be expected to embrace the West's vision of humanity's inexorable evolution towards democracy and the end of autocratic rule. Rather, they can be expected to do what autocracies have always done, resist the encroachments of liberalism in the interest of their own long-term survival, which is exactly what they both have been doing. Nor do Russia and China welcome the liberal West effort to promote liberal politics around the globe, least of all in regions of strategic importance to them. Their reactions to the color revolutions in Ukraine, Georgia, and I guess that's Kazakhstan, were hostile and suspicious, and understandably so. Western liberals see political upheaval in these countries as part of a natural, if uneven, evolution toward liberalism and democracy, but the Russians and Chinese see nothing natural in these occurrences, only Western-backed coups designed to advance Western influence in strategically vital parts of the world. And he says here, Kagan, their suspicion and hostility towards our advances in these areas are understandable. And he's talking about these color revolutions, which, if you say that the United States was involved in the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014, what are you called? You're called a conspiracy theorist. Where did you get this notion that the United States was involved? Well, where? Well, 2006. Robert Kagan's talking about our color revolutions in these countries. So it's not a conspiracy theory. Our elites openly talk about what we do. And he continues. Are they so wrong? Might not the successful liberalization of Ukraine, urged and supported by the Western democracies, be but the prelude to the incorporation of that nation into NATO and the European Union? In short, the expansion of Western liberal hegemony. As Trina notes, the Kremlin is getting ready for the battle for Ukraine in all seriousness. And it understands, too, that the departure of Alexander Lukashenko from power in Belarus could well push Minsk onto the Ukrainian Euro-Atlantic path. So, he says here that Russia, the Kremlin, is getting ready for the battle for Ukraine in all seriousness. 2006, 18 years ago, our elites were acknowledging that Ukraine was a battleground and that Russia was taking it very seriously. Of course, in 2008, we have that memo that was released by WikiLeaks. It was authored by Bill Burns, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, our current CIA director, where he says if we get involved in Ukraine, we could trigger a civil war that would tear the country apart, and that Russia would have to choose at some point whether or not to intervene. He wrote that in 2008, 2014, Maidan, civil war, 8 years of civil war, and then Russia intervenes. So, why did Russia invade Ukraine? Well, we explained it 14 years ago, or 16 years ago. We knew why. But today, our elites, these same people, pretend to be ignorant, and they say because Russia, Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union. Insanity. And also, too, the talk of incorporating NATO and the European Union. Who was, in 2006, the ambassador to NATO from the United States? It was Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan's wife. She was the U.S. ambassador to NATO in 2006. And of course, it was 2008 where George Bush mentioned extending NATO to Ukraine. And as we admit here, it is the expansion of Western liberal hegemony. That's what it's for, our power. Yet today, we claim that NATO is a defensive alliance that is open to anyone. And Russia should not view it as being an attack on them. Preposterous. We know what it is. It's a way to encircle Russia and expand our power economically and militarily. And Russia does not want that on their doorstep, especially in Ukraine, which is a critical country for them. But what do? We push forward anyway. We helped in overthrowing their government in Ukraine in 2014. We had the civil war for years and years and years, and eventually Russia decides to intervene. And again, we pretend like we don't understand why. It's crazy. And the final part here, the world is a complicated place, and it's not about to divide into a simple Manichaean struggle between liberalism and autocracy, which is, good and evil. Russia and China are not natural allies. Both need access to the markets of the liberal West. And both share interests with the Western liberal powers. But as autocracies, they do have important interests in common, both with each other and with other autocracies. All are under siege in an era when liberalism does seem to be expanding. No one should be surprised if in response an informal league of dictators has emerged, sustained and protected by Moscow and Beijing as best they can. The question will be what the United States and Europe decide to do in response. Unfortunately, Al-Qaeda may not be the only challenge liberalism faces today, or even the greatest. So Russia and China are not natural allies, but as Kagan points out in 2006, if they are under threat from the West and Europe, they may find a way to work together, and that is exactly what has happened now. China and Russia are working together with North Korea, with Iran, and other countries to protect themselves against what they view as an encroachment from the West. And Kagan is right here when he says that our greatest threat today is not Al-Qaeda. Well, we're the ones who actually fund Al-Qaeda. And in fact, in Syria right now, it is an Al-Qaeda offshoot that we supported in the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. So yeah, Al-Qaeda is not our greatest threat. It does seem to be Russia and China, but not necessarily because Russia and China caused this, but because the United States is hell-bent on expansion. on pushing into Ukraine and other Eastern European countries. We're arming Taiwan. We can't help ourselves. And so we create our enemies by antagonizing them. Now, does that mean that Russia and China are perfect? Of course not. I always point this out. I'm an American. I like the American system. And Russia and China don't have the freedoms that we have. But as an American, I can't control their governments. Excuse me. I can only criticize and hopefully through my vote influence my own government and what we do. And I want to have some peace on this planet because we have 3 countries that are nuclear powers. And if we ever have a direct conflict, things could spiral out of control and we have nuclear annihilation. That's what scares me. And so we keep on antagonizing Russia and Putin. We have all these talks about nuclear weapons, and maybe we could use maybe Putin might use a battlefield nuke in Ukraine, or we could have a limited nuclear exchange. All that's craziness. Once one nuke goes off, that'll be the first of many, and we will destroy this planet. And in my opinion, Ukraine and Taiwan are not worth global annihilation. Yet our elites somehow think that we can push there and that China and Russia will not push back, or they'll push back but only to a certain extent. We're essentially playing chicken. And I think that's a very crazy game to play. And when you have countries that feel that their existence is threatened, they are capable of anything. So it's actually kind of a good thing, not a bad thing, that Russia is surviving. If they were crashing, if their economy was in complete shambles, if they were losing militarily, then they could lash out and do something like launch a nuke that could spell the end of humanity. And that is what we do not want. So 2006, Robert Kagan, husband of Victoria Nuland, explaining back then the situation geopolitically. And so in 2025, when these same elites say, we don't understand why Russia invaded Ukraine, we don't understand Putin's behavior, they are lying. They understood perfectly well. And in fact, they were actually anticipating or even planning for these things to happen. Their goal was the collapse of Russia and the collapse of the Putin government. That's what they were hoping for. It failed. It didn't work. But unfortunately for us, when they make plans, even when they're losing, they never reconsider and pull back. They just keep on trudging forward, hoping to get their result. So, will they get that result? Doesn't look like it. And again, the concern is escalation. But we will have Trump in office in 16 days, and hopefully he can negotiate with Vladimir Putin, although it is now very complicated, and he's realizing that he can't simply make a phone call and end the war. Putin will not play that game. They've lost too much, and Russia will want to make sure that when this war's over, they have all their interests protected, and it was worth the sacrifice they have made, because they have lost a lot of men, not as much as Ukraine claims, but the war has been costly for them in terms of lives, and they are not going to just settle for the first offer that Donald Trump throws out there. So it will be a complicated process, but we will just have to wait and see what happens. Well, that is it for now. If you're new to my channel, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.